We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The conflict between Ukraine and Russia is driving all the headlines. But far from being a localized issue, the ramifications are spreading across the globe. From the corridors of Washington, D.C., to the oil fields of Caracas, to the World Wide Web, few elements of life are left unaffected. But what does it all mean in terms of domestic politics? And are we truly in an information war? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk how Ukraine will impact the 2022 midterms, how social media is playing an outsized role in this war, and a lot more. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Park Hills, Missouri on KFMO 1240 AM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. All politics is local, so the saying goes. But what does this mean when the world's attention is fixated on the burgeoning crisis in Ukraine? And perhaps more importantly for Americans, how is Russia's invasion impacting events on the home front? Well, we're fortunate to have with us today Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this very radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Always good to be back, Mark.
So, Tim, after witnessing President Zelensky's impassioned speech to Congress, Tim, you wrote that it was essentially delivered for an audience of one, that audience being President Joe Biden. And it was a challenge to him, wasn't it? And is Biden himself, is he ready for that challenge, do you think?
Well, I think that's the $64,000 question, which adjusting for inflation, Mark, probably becomes a $64 million question. But all kidding aside, it depends, I think, whether Biden is ready for that challenge, I think depends on how much courage it takes to meet the challenge. Because one of the things I've written about on Liberty Nation recently is how Joe Biden has never been forced to, and therefore never has, demonstrated real political courage. Everything he's done has been really a product of groupthink, product of taking safe choices, being cautious. So to this point, that is not really hindering the effort to stop Putin to the extent that NATO has picked up the ball. You know, the French President Macron has been aggressive on the diplomatic front. The German Chancellor, the new one, Scholz, has been very forward in significantly increasing the German defense budget. So NATO, which of course has a lot more at stake because of geographic proximity, if nothing else, they have stepped up to the plate, and Biden has done exactly what he has done for 50 years of his political career, and something that he learned from Barack Obama, learned the lesson very well, which is leading from behind. And that's what he's doing right now. And I think the war effort is still been pretty aggressive, but there's going to come a time when instead of him looking to NATO for leadership, they're going to have to look to him as the leader of the free world. And I don't think most people that I know anyway are anxious to see the answer to that question, because he's never been put in this kind of position before. The one time that he has engaged in serious foreign policy in an aggressive effort was in Afghanistan. And of course, that was a disaster. He needs to fix his foreign policy legacy. And I suggest that with Ukraine, he has the opportunity to correct the course, but he also could double down and guarantee a complete legacy of failure.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about leading from behind, it does seem that President Biden is almost riding the coattails of public popular opinion. And it really does come down to the groupthink that you just mentioned, where it seems that there's a committee behind making his decisions. And that committee's purpose is not so much to ensure that the results are positive for America and her allies, but that the results are positive for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party machine. Now, speaking of that machine, it seems to me that the DC denizens are more concerned with keeping up appearances. They say the right words. They put flags on their social media bios. And if you're the teachers union president, they put the flag upside down and then, of course, misspell Ukraine on your next one. That's a worry for the the education of America. But are they all more really concerned with what's happening back home? So could this almost united show of support that we're seeing coming out of Washington, could it be more part of a basic campaigning strategy, do you think? Or am I being too
Well,
jaded?
no, you're not being too. You're actually being insufficiently jaded, Mark,
That is a
because
first, the
because
first for the world.
because I could answer, the old game show. I could name that tune in one note. I could answer that question in one sentence with a little more detail. But basically, the only thing that all of them are concerned about now is the next election, which comes up in November. And Ukraine is useful to the extent that it can help them signal their virtue and look like they're behind the poor, struggling people of Ukraine. And to the extent that helps them with their election campaign, sure, they'll be behind it. And it's so easy. Let's face it. What could be easier than running for Congress and standing up there and condemning Vladimir Putin and saying that President Zelensky is a hero? I expect to hear a lot of that because, like we talked about with Joe Biden in terms of courage, it takes zero courage to get behind the Ukrainian effort at this point. The question is, when it comes to a matter of, for example, having to amp up the war effort, are they going to have to make a decision that involves possible American military involvement on the ground or in the air? What's going to happen then? How will they handle the issue then, when it's not just in a political sphere where it's the easiest thing in the world to do what everybody else in the world is doing, which is to support Zelensky and give him a standing ovation and show your admiration for the determination of the American people, and that Zelensky should be man of the year, times person of the year, excuse me, for 2022. He's already got that wrapped up. So yeah, it's useful, sure. And because Biden's president and he can say the right things and slap a bunch of sanctions on, which is easy to do, he can call Putin a war criminal. That's easy to do. But when it comes to really hard decisions, he hasn't had to do it. So sure, the Democrats are going to draft off of the Ukraine issue for as long as they can.
How do you see the GOP's role in all this? Now, there is a long-running debate going on about who is the party of war, and I think that distinction has been the lines on that have been so blurred over the last few years. But do you think that Republicans are any more hawkish at the moment with regards to Ukraine and Russia than the present crop of Democrats?
Actually, Mark, the answer I think is yes. The Republicans are a little more hawkish. They believe that Biden could be a little more aggressive in coming to the defense of Ukraine, even though they're not a NATO country. Let's be clear. They're not an Article 5 obligation for the United States to protect them as they would for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the other 26 countries in Europe that are part of NATO. So they don't have that absolute obligation, but they see the geopolitical stakes of this and the message that Putin will get if he's allowed to overrun Ukraine. So they're more willing to take the risk of engaging in warfare, I think, in order to roll Putin back than the Democrats are. And that's not surprising because the Democrats are led by a cautious president. The Republicans have just come off a president who's anything but cautious, but he also kept the peace for 4 years, right? So I think that Republicans are posturing to be a little tougher. And I think one of the things they could do is to point out a no-fly zone could have been instituted before the invasion took place. A no-fly zone should have been instituted when Putin was lining his troops by the tens of thousands along the Ukrainian border. That would have been the time to do the no-fly zone.
So, Tim, despite what the posturing we're seeing from both Democrats and Republicans, and of course the president and international leaders, Do you think the American people have an appetite for an actual war?
There's no question the American people do not have an appetite for war, Mark. They're concerned about kitchen table issues, so to speak, like inflation, like the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, all of which are rising rapidly. And they figure that a war will only make those problems worse, and they're correct about it. So they have no appetite for war, and that's why Joe Biden is being so cautious. Some might call it timid.
Very true, Tim. And I think those kitchen table issues, they're not getting much in the way of media headlines at the moment, because everything is subsumed by the headlines by the Ukraine war. And
that's an advantage for Joe Biden. Those issues have been taken off the table, and he's able to change the subject to Ukraine and able to issue a bunch of executive orders and ramp up the sanctions regime on Russia. Those are things that are easy to do without going to war.
No challenge for challengeless Joe Biden. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Coming up later in the show, we examine the to and fro on Florida's controversial so-called Don't Say Gay bill. But up next, we dive deep into how the images from Ukraine are shaping public perception. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fighting for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.